to do this, and then I'm going to jump out of Zoom. But have fun, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, and we're live.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Community Office Hours. We're here today talking about Boundary. It's wonderful. Just as a reminder, we love questions. We love interaction and chat. As we talk about some of the stuff, Boundary stuff today, please do put your comments and questions in the chat. We do want to hear from you. But as a general rule, just be professional and be welcoming, be considerate, and be respectful. I'll post the community guidelines in the chat. And that way you can reference them in more detail. All right, we have two esteemed guests here today, both of them returning to Community Office Hours. I would have given a dramatic intro, except I don't have a dramatic enough voice. Neither do I have dramatic sound effects. So we'll start with Jim and then we'll go to Rob. But would you care to introduce yourselves and say hello to the Community Office Hours group?
Hi, my name is Jim Lambert. I'm an engineering lead on the Boundary team.
Hey, I'm Rob Barnes, aka DevOps Rob, and I'm a senior developer advocate here at HashiCorp, focused on the secure product line. Thanks for having us.
Excellent. So you've probably seen both of them on the channel before talking about Boundary, but here we are going to, I think we're going to talk about two big topics, and I think they're the most commonly asked questions that we've gotten on Boundary Community Office Hours. So I'm going to ask the big one. The question that I think we've gotten at every single Boundary Office Hours, which is, does Boundary support event logging, audit logging, etc.? Jim, I hear that there may be some progress on that front, and you might be here today to talk a little bit about that.
I am here to talk a little bit about that. Thank you for having us on. So as of 050, one of our later releases, I think 051 is out now, but Boundary will emit events. It will emit events for system things, for errors, for observations. I'll talk about what observations are a little bit. And then there's also kind of a work in process, a preview of audit events as well. So just the whole audits will change before they GA. There's no doubt the structure will change, the data that's there that's changed. It really is a preview of audit events. I just want to put that out there just to be clear first, but you can make, right now you can make Boundary spit out things that look like audit events. And so I'll talk a little about what those are like, what changes are coming, and then just in general what audits are, what events are all about in Boundary. And I'll give a short demo after chit-chatting a little bit about it. But I also want to thank the entire Boundary team for helping getting this work out. This is the culmination of a lot of work that started way back when Boundary started as well. We started talking about observability and events. And everybody on the team had a hand in making it happen. But in particular, Sarah Christoph started working on this shortly after she joined the team in February. And then she put up with me when I joined her kind of full-time on the effort sometime around early June, and together we kind of brought this feature home near the final stages of the process. But first, I just want to talk about what are events in Boundary. Like, what are they and what do we mean by events? Because I don't want people to confuse them, Boundary events and event logging and EDA, right? Because they're related, but they're not really the same thing. So first off, like I said, we always plan to do events in Boundary as part of our foundational RFCs. ICU 004, yes, the fourth RFC we wrote was all about observability, and it talks a lot about events and what we were going to try to do with them. In that RFC, we talked about kind of three pillars, three, not four, three, I can count. Three pillars for Boundary observability were going to be events, metrics, and tracing. So, you notice I didn't say logging. A lot of people will say for the three pillars, they'll say logging, metrics, and traces, and I said events. So, you could do structured logs, right? And, all events can be represented as structured logs, but not all structured logs are events. They're a little different, right? So what do I mean by an event? An event contains contextual information and context and data about a unit of work. So you could recreate events from structured logs, but in my mind, you'd probably have to correlate and aggregate maybe hundreds of structured log entries and add some contextual information to build an event. right? To understand the request, the response, any kind of data that went into, that might be littered across a lot of structured log entries. And you'd have to kind of figure that out. But an event would kind of bring them all together as a unit of work and provide contextual information about them. So from the start with Boundary, we knew we wanted to do events, you know. We also wanted to support this idea of observability events, which has kind of been going around the industry for a while. Martin Fowler wrote about it quite a while ago. And then people like Charity Majors at Honeycomb, she's been kind of leading this charge. And that's kind of Honeycomb's whole business model too, but she's been kind of like out there ringing the bell for observation events as well. So we really knew from the start we wanted to support those ideas as well. Just like I said before, observability events are conceptually related to EDA event, you know, design, data architecture and stuff like that, but it's really not EDA, right? You can send these observation events and these boundary events if you wanted to using an EDA, but they're not really the same thing. So we want to make sure people understand we're not talking about event sourcing or something like that. We're talking about boundary events and related to system information, related to errors, related to observations, and related to audits. Doesn't mean in the future we might not leverage the stuff we've used, but that aren't any current plans right now to do those kind of things in Boundary. So, and I also want to be clear, just like the rest of Boundary, privacy and security are important in our event data. And from the ground up, our event infrastructure has been designed to do redaction and encryption of sensitive and secret data. So built right into all the infrastructure is this idea of privacy and security as well. So what does it mean that when I say Boundary emits events? Now I've talked a little bit about what it is and what it's not. So what does it really mean? So I'll talk about the several types of events that Boundary currently does. So if an error event now happens, first I want to say just a precursor to that is that Boundary's been pretty quiet, right? You run Boundary right now in production, it doesn't say much. Like, it doesn't say much at all. It's just like running away there. You don't know if a request happened or if a response happened. You really don't have any information on latency. It's pretty silent partner. So that's good in some ways and really bad in others. So Boundary's getting a lot more chatty with 0.50, right? But we also provided some capabilities to filter those events as well. So when an error event happens now in Boundary, it will emit an event. You'll see something in standard error. If you're running Boundary without any configuration for events, just standard, there's a default event sync for standard error, and you'll get an error event. And I'll show that in a minute. But so for example, if someone forgets a parameter in a required request, so they're trying to authenticate and forget to put the password in, you'll get an error event. It'll say an error happened, the parameter was missing, right? And you can configure those error events to go to a separate sync if you want to, and you can rotate them on however you want to do, but Boundary will emit these error events. And in Boundary, you can't really turn off right now error events. They're coming out. You can decide to put them to dev null if you want to, but they're coming out, right? Boundary's going to start emitting these things. The other thing that Boundary will emit right now are these things called system events. By the way, you can't filter error events. You can filter any kind of event. But it's also going to put out system events. And system events are things like worker authenticated to control plane. So as workers come and go, you see some of that already in Boundary, but you'll see that in system events and other system events as well as we go along. And then another type of event that Boundary do is, I call it an observation. And an observation is like, oh, well, this API request happened, and it happened and it had this much latency, it had this request, it had this response, it was the status code. And that's kind of all summary information about the observation. It might include details, and that detail can be a slice of details. The summary information is kind of about the whole event. The details are ordered based on time that they were evented. So you could see a slice of order, and you could actually see, oh, this is the things that happen in order as they happen. So in the initial release, we don't really have any details, but the system supports adding details to these observations. And then finally, of course, audit events. The thing that people always ask us about is when is Boundary going to do auditing? And of audit event, if you turn those on, even in preview, like for an API request, to get the kind of stuff you think you would get in an audit event. And we're still building that out, and I'll talk about why that was delayed in a little bit. But once you start to talk about audit events, you have to really be careful about, because you're going to start to include every request response, every protobuf that goes and comes in the API, and you need to be able to make sure you're handling the sensitive and secret data appropriately. And in our world in Boundary with what we've built, that means you have to classify each attribute. you have to mark it as public or sensitive or secret. And then you have to provide the abilities for the operators to decide what they want to do. Do they want to HMAC secret information, HMAC 256 it, or do they want to encrypt it? So we're building all those things in. But just tagging all the protobufs is a really, really large task because it's quite a large API service. And so we have a lot of protobufs still to tag and make sure we get that right. And we can't get it wrong because we don't want to leak sensitive or secret data. So the other thing about Boundary events is we've standardized kind of our standard format is cloud events. So if you follow CNCF, they had this large effort to do cloud events, and they have a spec about interoperability and formats. And we decided to adopt the format of cloud events so that if you wanted to take the file, the events we emit, and you wanted to send them along as cloud events via an EDA somewhere else, you can do that. You can use Fluentd to stick them somewhere else and process them just like you would any other cloud event. So we support the format of cloud event, and it's a JSON format by default. We also kind of have a pretty printed version of cloud events, which is text-based. And then we chose to support an HC log version of our events because that's what all of HashiCorp products kind of look and smell like. They do HC logging. And we were really worried that our operators and our users might have existing tooling that were processing HC logs. And if we change the format just willy-nilly on them, that would break the stuff they're used to working on. So we wanted to accommodate that as well. So we built an event node that would output this as HC log as well. So I talked a little bit briefly before, there's this idea of syncs in Boundary for events. So you can create different file syncs. You can say, I want my audits to go to this file sync or that file sync, and I want this file sync to have this filters on it. I only want these kind of audit events over there, and I have this deny set of filters over there. So you can create filters on your syncs, and you can split your, you can split the stuff up to all different files. You can rotate those files based on number of bytes or number of days or how many versions you want to keep. So all kind of the standard log rotate stuff is built into the file syncs that we support. And we support a standard error sync, of course, because you kind of have to. We're like, where is this stuff going? There's a lot of things only do standard error in this modern world of Kubernetes, right? Everything goes to standard error, standard out. So we support that as well. You can configure Boundary with the configuration file, of course, and we're supporting sync configuration in there as well. So you can define the syncs you want and stuff like that. You can turn off audit, turn off error, whatever you want to do for the eventing. In the future, we're working on an API as well, so that you'll be able to do some of your configuration for your eventing in an API as well. So eventing in the future will be a combination of files that will be used for startup configuration. So if you have an event that happens during startup, before you talk to the control plane, you can get that event out. And then once you talk to the control plane, you can pull down the global event configuration and say, oh, I'm a worker, I need to also do these events, and send it to these syncs as well. So kind of a mishmash capability there for doing configuration kind of in a global sense. You don't have to go to every worker, every controller to add a new sync in. You can just put it in the database via the API, and yay, I did Terraform, and it's everywhere. But you can also splat one in right when you do a startup to make sure you didn't lose some kind of critical error at startup. I can't talk to the database. I can't talk to the KMS or something like that. So that's all kind of that background. I know I'm meandering, but I'm going to get to a demo, I promise. I just wanted to talk for a few minutes about the underlying infrastructure. So eventing's been going on at HashiCorp for a long time, right? Nomad does audit events, Console does audit events, Vault does audit events. Well, a few years ago, HashiCorp embarked upon building a library to do common eventing, a common event infrastructure thing called Go Event Logger. And it's very extendable. It has a broker, it has pipelines, has this idea of nodes, so you can add nodes as you need them. Like I said before, it's used by several other HashiCorp products. And I think Vault has some plans to adopt it as well. I don't know where those plans are as well. But by the way, many of the Vault engineers contributed to this library and its foundation. There have been a ton of thought and effort into this library, and you can use it too. Any of the devs out there that want to adopt eventing and they need redaction and encryption for their eventing, the library's out there. You can wire it into your product as well. But there have been like 6 or 7 RFCs over the years. First one written by, I think, by Jeff Mitchell and some other collaborators. Then Nick Nick and Mike wrote one, and that first one was, I think, in 2018, 2019, and then there've been like 4 or 5 since then. Kit wrote one for console. I don't want to forget somebody. I think Sarah wrote one. Drew wrote one for Nomad. It's been a lot of people that have contributed to the ideas behind it and the implementation. And if you look at the library, you'll find all kinds of nodes to do all kinds of cool things. So, and it's really extendable, which is kind of cool. So that's the foundation that Boundary built upon to do its eventing. It's not something that we just built ourselves. We stood on the shoulders of the other engineers at HashiCorp. And I just want to point that out. It really made the work doable in the time we had to do it. So with all that said, if there aren't any questions, or do you have questions, let's see if you have any questions first, and then if not, I can do a demo. Awesome.
So we have one question in the chat, not necessarily about eventing, but I have many questions about eventing. So we'll start with the question in the chat. Is token injection by workers coming out of the pipeline soon? And the answer is it's not available yet. Last community office hours, we did talk about token and credential injection using Vault credential brokering. You can use Vault credential brokering to broker the credentials into the worker nodes, injected into a session by worker nodes, and then you never pass the credentials back to the user. So that is, if you have any further questions, feel free to ask in chat, but that is the official answer at this point. We also have a second question in chat, and this is about eventing. Can we have multiple syncs per event types? Why or why not?
Yes, you can. You can have as many event syncs as you want. So if you want your audit events to be split up, you can filter them if you'd like to. Or you can you want to send them to different locations. You want to use FluentD and on one side to send them off to Kafka if you wanted to do that, or you wanted to just put them to Elasticsearch or something like that. And you can filter them by appropriateness if you wanted to too. So you could filter your events, and you could say, I want to allow filters for these audit events. I only want to see audit events for maybe authentication or something like that. And you're going to send them off to a SIEM or something. SIEM, is that how you say that? S-E-I-M, SIEM. Yeah. You're going to send them off to that yourself from FluentD or something, or Elasticsearch or Splunk or something. You know, you can do all those kind of integrations, and that's why we support multiple event syncs per event type.
So I am curious about so you mentioned observability, and some folks argue that traces, right, are a bit of telemetry that it would be very important for observability. So how is Boundary collecting, I guess, traces, or is it tracing? Is it not tracing? Is it a custom eventing library that's within Boundary? How are these events being collected, or how are they being traced within Boundary itself?
Yeah, it's a great question. So tracing is one of our pillars of the observability from our original RFC on it when we started Boundary, and it's planned. We haven't built it yet, right? So, but one of the things and I'll show it in the demo, we have the idea of a trace ID in all of our events. So if there is a trace going on and there's a context for that trace and an ID, it will be in the context for the events. So you'll be able to tie your traces to your event. So if you looked at an audit event, then you could go over to Jaeger or whatever you're using for your collector and your display, you know, for searching your traces, whatever you've decided for your infrastructure. When we support that, and you'll be able to look at that and say, okay, well, what happened? Where did this come in? What microservices did it go to? When did it hit Boundary? Whatever the case may be. So, so we will support tracing in the future and metrics as well. You know, with the traditional metrics, and they'll be correlated together. So we built logging, this whole like logging events, these observability events first, because they're kind of like table stakes. You got to start there, right? If you don't know, if Boundary is just silent and it's not telling you anything, it's just sitting there doing its stuff, it's kind of hard to correlate into the data. So we started with that stuff as well. We talked to a lot of people about what they wanted first. One of the groups we talked to was HCP, of course, because we're going to be partnering with them in the future. So what did they want first? And we started there. Tracing is definitely on the table, and you will see Boundary in the future do tracing. I can't say when at this point. It is planned work, but I just can't make a commitment to when that will happen. But it will happen, definitely. And you will see traditional metrics, Prometheus type things as well. Awesome. Right, and the tracing will be correlated with all the events we produce as well.
Interesting. All right. I don't think we have any more questions coming in, so let's proceed to demo.
Okie, let's pray that this all goes well.
May the demo
And
gods be
even
with
if it
you.
doesn't. Yeah.
Yeah, we just started. I got to look at my notes here. Let me just get set up here.
Did anyone say, send gracious vibes to for demos working today? I forgot to do that.
I made a couple sacrifices this morning just to make sure that it works. So first off, I'm going to do is just start at Boundary Dev. If I can spell boundary, that would be helpful. Boundary Dev. So out of the box, we're going to start with Boundary Dev, and it's going to use Cloud Events text space when and if it ever starts. So we're already seeing system events. So if you looked at 05 or later, you'll start to see these things, and you'll see some. This is a cloud event type format. It's just JSON pre-printed, so it's considered text, not JSON, because it's got a bunch of other crap in it as well. You can just produce JSON as well, so it doesn't have kind of pre-printed. And you can see there's some envelope information that's required by cloud events, and then there's a payload, and there's a version for the data. You know where it came from, and you know the information it's trying to communicate to you. And then, so those are all system events. So if I come over here and I say, let's do an authentication. If I can find an authentication. There we go. So I'm just gonna authenticate. And now we'll see an observation. See a different type of event. We'll see an observation that said, oh, well, we started this thing here. We had a 200. We stopped it here. There was some latency. And here was information about what happened during that event. So that's kind of the idea of what an observation looks like as well. So you can see there are no surprises here. It's pretty straightforward for those kinds of things. And let me show you an error event then. This, if I don't put a parameter in there, so you'll get 2 events from that request. You got an error, which said we had an error. It was the code was 100. We're missing the password from authentication and some other information about what happened. And of course, you had an observation as well, because the request was made and we wanted to make an observation about that too. So right now, all these events are going to standard error, and that's kind of the out-of-the-box way Boundary Dev works. If you wanted to configure it and run Boundary Server and controller, you can go into the HCL for Boundary and configure it. So that kind of shows.
Hey, Jim, can you increase the text size?
Oh yeah, I thought I made it big enough, but
both sides. There we go. I think it's the JSON blobs in general.
yeah, they're hard to read. Okay, let's see if I can you see my whole window? Okay, is that better?
Yep, that's
Thank
better.
you. Okay, so that's kind of that. I showed the defaults. I showed an error, showed errors. I just want to show you some of the other formats. So what I'm going to start up now, I'll start up with cloud events. Maybe I'll start it with HC log, just so you can see what that boundary dev event format HC log text. Just so you see what those are like, and be very familiar for everyone who's ever run a HashiCorp product. It looks strangely like an HC log. And if I did boy, I should learn how to type. You see that, you can see that you actually get an observation, and it looks just like HC log. It's just not JSON. Pretty straightforward. The other thing I wanted to show you was filtering. So let me clear this. And I'll show you just a couple allow filters. So I'm going to start boundary dev. And this particular command will start boundary dev, and it will have two allow filters. One will say, I want to see things that were related to authentication, and I want to see system events that were for create client connections. So I start that up. It will start up at some point in time. And we'll see we had one system event instead of two, and that was the one that was related to connecting. And then if I come over here and authenticate, if I could authenticate with the right password, you'll see we did get an observation for authentication, which is great. But then if I go ahead and do, let's say, users, users list, you'll see we didn't get any observation at all. That's because we're filtering out. We said we're only going to allow things that were related to authentication. So you can do that. You can do allow, you can do deny, you can do a bunch of different event filtering as well, and you can have as many of them as you want. The other thing I wanted to show you is audits, since that's what everyone kind of, I think, came to see. So I'm turning on kind of this preview flag, and I'm turning on audit events here. And I'm going to format them as JSON, and I'm going to pipe them to a JQ command that I do that will magically ignore the text and only look at the JSON that comes out. So I'm going to start that up so we can see an audit event. So we got some events, right? Some system events when we started. Let's go ahead and authenticate. And we have an audit event here. So this is your audit event right here. It says it's audit. It will tell you a bunch of data, request information. It'll show you the protobuf that was inbound. And it failed, so we didn't get an outbound one because I don't know how to type. Still don't know how to type. There we go. So now let's look at the response here. We see a response protobuf as well. And you'll also notice that even in the response protobuf, the token is redacted. So by default, it was set up for redaction, not for encryption or HMAC, but you can configure that as well. So on the inbound, the password that I typed in was redacted. You can see the rest of the inbound protobuf. And the outbound, the token is redacted. You can see the rest of the protobuf from outbound. So that's what audits look like in preview as well. So I showed you the different formats. I've showed you the filtering that supports by Boundary. I've talked about how you can configure different syncs, and you can turn on encryption and other HMAC SHA-256 for audits as well. And I've showed you a preview. So that's kind of really all I felt like I needed to show for audits. It kind of shows, it gives you a brief idea of how it's out there and gives you some idea of its capabilities and what it can do. And it also gives you an idea of where we're headed for audits. And so we have some things to think about with audits, and we're working on them already. And some of the things will defer and some of them we won't, but we will GA audits when we can feel comfortable that we've got all our data properly classified. And so that we're not going to have security concerns or sensitive data leaked because a protobuf wasn't properly. And as you can imagine, there are tens or not hundreds of protobufs in Boundary that need to be tagged.
Yeah, I can imagine that. And it does, you know, for those who are tuning in and rewatching the recordings of this, you know, the schemas you'll see today may or may not change. The things that you see today, the fields may also change as well. So keep that in mind. Don't go ahead and just start configuring your security information events management with those exact schemas in mind, right? And so we want to do our due diligence. You know, this is a security tool, so we do want to make sure that we're covering everything that we can.
Yeah, and to go back to a question you had before about multiple syncs, like I can see where you would set up a sync where everything's redacted, and just make that generally available to people if they wanted to look at audits. And then I could see you set up a sync that nothing's redacted and secure that sync and give that to your security or to your SIEM directly, depending on what you needed for that information. Or you just might want to have a correlatable, you know, and do SHA-256 type stuff. So yeah, it's kind of all over the place about what you need, and we're not trying to impose a security flow on our operators. We're trying to support whatever their needs are.
Awesome. So we have another question in chat, and then we'll move on to Rob. The question in chat is that there are allow filters. Will deny filters be added anytime soon?
Yes, there are deny filters already. So you can add deny filters already. Sorry, I didn't show one. I can if you need me to, but Yeah, deny filters are applied first, and then the allow filters are applied. So there is an order of precedence there. Yeah, we do all the denies first, and then if you get past that, then we'll think about the allows for the request. But yes, those are supported already.
Awesome. I'm very excited about this because, as you pointed out, Boundary kind of just stayed a little silent. Like there wasn't much information for me to understand what was going on. So if I was debugging a request, I wasn't necessarily sure if it quite made it. So I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. And I'm hoping, that we can partner with our users and DevRel people and stuff like that, and understand what the real needs are, right? I mean, we've got something out there now. We need to hear from people, and it can be as trivial as, I don't like that this one gets sent all the time. Can we just remove this? Like system event is a good example. Like it can be too chatty, right? So if there's a system event where we have the ability to suppress events internally in Boundary as well, if we decide that it just never needs to be admitted. So, if we're emitting something just not adding value and you see it all the time, well, let's have a discussion about it. And if you want to see something that we're not emitting all the time, then we can have a discussion about it as well.
Awesome. If you have folks who are tuning in, if you have any suggestions on this, post and discuss, post on GitHub. Definitely, and anything as you're trying this out, definitely post and describe or recommend anything you want to see from eventing. So thank you very much, Jim. All right, Rob, we are now here to talk about the second often asked question, which is Boundary plus Terraform.
Well, I do have a bit of imposter syndrome following Jim's demo there. That was awesome. I think the work that the entire Boundary team is doing is awesome. And yeah, I'm really lucky to be working alongside such great people. With that said, another thing I love about my job is I am you. When it comes to the community, I am you and you are me. So your pain is my pain. And it means that I spend a lot of time trying to understand where you're struggling, where you're having pain points. And I do my best to try and implement in the wider ecosystem solutions to help that, which is kind of what I'm here to talk to you about today. So when we think about Boundary, we think about the whole process of getting started, maybe a proof of concept or something like that. Generally speaking, you'll do what Jim did in his demo and you'll use Boundary Dev, right? So in fact, let me just share my screen and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so you should be able to see my screen now, right? So if I just run Boundary Dev, it should start up in dev mode, right? When it decides to start, right? Okay, so it started in dev mode. And then what we'll do is we will just swipe to here and we'll just have a quick look. We'll pull up the browser for it. And here you have dev mode, right? So you're able to log in because you have some resources that are pre-generated, right? So you have an auth method, you have users, you have roles, you have a project, an organization. All of these resources are generated for you, right? I think it's password. I hope I typed that correctly. It should let me in. And it tells me that it's not a great password. Well, it did not let me in. No, it didn't let me in. Give me a second. It's not letting me in. Don't worry. I'll explain it in a second, right? So basically, what I'm trying to say is that when it comes to the dev mode, you're able to log in, you have all these generated resources. But the question is, when you want to kind of graduate from dev mode and go into non-dev mode, how do you go about doing that, right? So we have some documentation here, which I'll pull up on this screen. I'll zoom the screen a little bit. And here it kind of just shows you the workflow that you have to go through, right? So you have this recovery KMS workflow. So if I actually just come back to my code and have a look at my config, you can see in the config, we have a KMS section, which is for recovery, which is here. So this is essentially how we're going to log in for the first time if you do not have dev mode enabled, right? And then once you're in, you're going to need to configure a series of things, right? You need to initialize the database, and then you need to create your login account, create the org and the project scopes, and an auth method, you need to create login accounts, you create a user that's attached to that, and then you need to create roles to manage the scopes. The point is there are a lot of things that you need to do in order to get started and get yourself into a point where you can do the initial configuration for Boundary, right? And if you've ever gone through this document and tried to go through this, you'll see it'll probably take you about 15-20 minutes to go through that. And you have to, remember IDs and copy IDs into the next command and so on and so forth. It can get a little bit of a spaghetti kind of tangle. But the great thing about Boundary is because it has first-class Terraform support, we don't have to go through all of this like that. We can literally just use Terraform to implement the same things and give us access to that, right? So that's pretty much what I've done. I've gone through this document, and as you can see, the good folks in the Boundary documentation team have created the Terraform resources for every step. And I've pretty much created a getting started module, which does this entire thing for you in a matter of seconds, really, versus 15-20 minutes of going through this and doing each step bit by bit. So if we just go back to my terminal, just pop this up, I'll just kill that because we don't need it anymore. We'll just clear the screen. And we'll just quickly set up my demo environment. So what we will do is we need a database, which is one of the core components. So I'm just going to use Docker Compose. I have a Compose file. And that will give me a database which we can access. And then what we need to do is we need to initialize that database. So we just run this command here. This is just to get us to the point where we have a server running, right? So we'll just quickly walk through this. We're initializing the database, and we're asking it to not create these resources, which it was doing as part of dev mode, right? We want a complete clean slate when it comes to Boundary. So we'll just run that. Cool, so we now have an initialized database. We should be able to just run Boundary now. Get it up and running in non-dev mode. Okay, so it looks like Boundary is running. We'll just test that. We'll go to the browser here. Just get rid of all of that. And here, so now you can see we're definitely not in dev mode. You can see we have no authentication methods enabled here. So how do you log in? How do you get to the point where you can do the initial configuration? If you're familiar with systems like Vault, we have this mechanism of a root token. Boundary is a little bit different. You don't necessarily have that root token. But if we look at the config, whoop, wrong way. We look at the config here. It's that same part that I pointed out to here. We can log in with this, right? But we don't want to go through all those steps that I just showed you in that document. What we want to do is just leverage the wider ecosystem and make use of the fact that we have Terraform there, right? So this is just some sample code that I put together to demonstrate this. So we're essentially using the Boundary provider, and in terms of logging in, we're using that same recovery key. So this is the same thing that was inside the config file. Now, before I continue, I want to add a caveat there. This is probably the least secure way you can do this, right? In terms of how you actually set up the KMS, there are definitely better ways than this statically defined within the config file method. However, to anyone that was working with me up to 30 minutes before this live stream, you'll know that I was having issues getting this demo working. So this is kind of the caveat I'm going to add. There are better ways to do this, but just for the purposes of this demo, we're going to use this KMS mechanism here, which we've defined in the config file, right? So this is just like any other Terraform provider. You normally need to set, like, for example, if it is Vault, you need to set the Vault address and the token and so on and so forth. This is just configuring this specific provider, and that's what you need is the recovery key to log in for the first time. And then here we have the module that I've developed, and this is just some sample code that I whipped together. So anyone that wants to use the module, I'll pop a link after I finish speaking in the chat. But essentially, you just want to pull it from here. And this is the latest version that we have. And you just want to configure a few things. Like, so basically we want to create an account that we can log in to do the initial configuration, right? So I'm just going to create an account called admin, and I'm going to give it a password of foo foo foo. Again, there are better ways to do this, but I want to be very descriptive in what I'm showing you and show you exactly what's going on under the hood. So it's creating an account with this password. We're just adding a description as well, which is one of the other things that you can do. We're also creating an organization called Office Hours. And we have another description for there. We're just saying it's the Office Hours organization scope. And then within that organization, we're creating a project called Developer Advocates. You can change this to whatever it is within your organization to get this started, right? And then again, we have a project description there. So that's pretty much a sample code. And hopefully, because I've had a lot of issues today with getting demos to work, this will work for me. Jim, I prayed for you. It's time for you to pray for me. So we'll just initialize this really quickly. And so far, it's looking okay. Okay, green is good. Green is always good. And I would just run a plan so we can just see exactly what's going on under the hood, right? So I run a Terraform plan. And yes, I probably do need to update this module to keep up with the times because one of the arguments I'm using is deprecated. So watch out for a future release of that, but it should work perfectly fine. But let's just kind of go through this, right? So if we go to the top of this, we are creating a user. We're adding an auth method as well with a password. We're creating a role here for anonymous logins. We're also creating an org admin. We're creating another role here for listings. Creating another role for project admins. There's like loads of roles. Basically, every single step that you saw inside that documentation is being created here, right? So that's our module. We'll just apply that. And hope demo gods please work. Hopefully we get green. We want green. We got green. So that's good, you know. I'm just patting myself on the back because to the viewers out there, you don't know the half of it, just the issues I've had today, just getting things to work, basic things. So I'm so glad that's worked. So what we'll do is we'll kind of head back to the, wrong one. We'll head back to the browser and we'll try and log in with this username here and this password here, right? So again, we'll just, let's just refresh that. Oh, it didn't work. What's going on here? Must be granted permissions to view this data. And demo gods are really messing with me today. Let's see if we can do it by the command line, which I can never remember how to do that. Just add another one here. Actually, I'm going to have to set up too many things. I need to set up some variables to point to the right boundary and all that. You get the gist of it. We're now in a situation where you can do the initial configuration of boundary. I think I've got some funky things going on my machine why things are breaking today. But the main point is you saw that this Terraform module has applied these 9 resources, which is the same 9 things that we needed to add here from this page here. And you should be in a position to configure your boundary. And yeah, that's all I have today. I'm really sorry the demo gods weren't fully with me. It's been just one of those days, I think. But I'm glad at least the Terraform module that I made has worked, right? So there's probably something I'm doing in the background that's messed up somewhere. But yeah, check it out. I'll just leave a link in the chat just in case you want to go ahead and try using this module yourself. And let me know if you have any kind of suggestions or, you know, I'm open to review and pull requests. If there's anything you want to add to the module or behavior you want to change, I'm always happy to get community support. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Rob. I put the link in the chat. Just confirm it's the right one.
All right.
I think
Okay.
it's the right module.
Let's have a look.
I used that module just this morning in some of my prep, so I don't know what's going on in your machine because it worked perfectly for me this morning.
Yeah, it's not like it's not the module. It's my machine. I've done something. I think I need to restart my machine. It's been on for weeks, and
It's the opposite of it works on my machine.
welcome to the real world.
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm curious about with the module, right, that to get you started to log into Boundary, how do you plan on iterating it over time, Rob? I know that there's you're versioning it, but what are your plans to iterate on the module as you get feedback and you progress?
Well, exactly that, right? So that's why I'm trying to get as many people to use the module as possible. The more people that are using it, the more feedback I can get. One thing I know Jim will attest to what I'm about to say is when you build something, whether it's a module or software, you can't imagine the ways that people are going to use it at the point when you're building it. So it's only when people try to use it in ways that you haven't thought about, it's at that point you can start to evaluate, okay, do I want to expand the capabilities of this, or maybe I'm doing too much of it? So yeah, the more people that use it, the more feedback I get, and ultimately it's one of my modules. So I take a keen interest in maintaining these things here. And yeah, I'm always just looking for people to just provide that feedback. That's the first step. Open up issues.
Awesome. There's a comment in the chat that they appreciate your cool when the demo is just letting loose.
Mate, like I say, you do not know the half of it. Like all day I've had issues after issues. I couldn't even get Docker to work this morning. That's how crazy it was.
No.
Yeah, so I think I just need to restart my machine, which I will. But yeah, the main thing is that the demo, the core part of the demo, the actual thing that I built, that worked, right?
Yes.
And Jim, it's good to know that Jim's using the module as well. Thank you so much. Jim has told me it worked for him, so that works,
Perfect.
So there you go. See, and then that makes everything all better.
Yes, exactly. It worked out.
Yeah.
There is a question in the chat just about MFA and any plans to introduce MFA. If you are using an IDP that supports OIDC, you should be able to use the MFA from your identity provider with the Boundary OIDC auth method. So that will provide you MFA. So as a note, I wanted to make sure we read that out loud from the chat. All right. So any other questions from the chat? Please drop them in there. I'll wait a couple minutes as we observe the dog.
There's actually an interesting point on what you just said about the OIDC auth method. So in this Terraform module, that isn't yet supported. So there's two schools of thoughts here. I could add functionality to support that into the module, or I could create a separate module which is designed for that purpose there. I'm still trying to evaluate what the best route is. Because my kind of theory when it comes to Terraform modules is to try to keep them as simple as possible. I think sometimes when you add too much capability to them, they become complicated to use. So I'm still thinking on that. If you have any thoughts or anything like that, drop it in the chat, or if it's after the fact and you're watching this, just reach out to me on Twitter or something like that and just tell me what your opinions are. Because ultimately it'll be you folks out there that are going to use the module. So whatever you say, it matters to me.
It reminds me a bit of what we used to do to set up AWS accounts with Terraform, right? Like, so in order to use Terraform, you needed to set up all of the right IAM policies for Terraform. But do you do that through Terraform locally, or do you set up a manual? It was just this very turtles all the way down kind of approach. And I do agree with you that keeping the getting started, right, without the OIDC auth method is a lot more effective, because then you have at least a way to get started and then configure the OIDC auth method and then remove the password authentication. Because I wouldn't necessarily trust myself to be able to set up the OIDC auth method right off the bat with all the correct policies. And then if I can't log in, well, I've just deployed and spent so much time configuring Boundary, I've just locked myself out.
Exactly. That's kind of the method I'm kind of leaning towards. But like I say, it is going to be based on what people want. So please make your voices be heard. You can reach out to me on the timeline. You can DM me. My DMs are open. However you want to use it, I will build it according to what the majority want. But I think what Rosemary was saying is kind of where I'm going with this. I think in a separate module to configure OIDC is probably the more pragmatic way of doing things.
Awesome. And we have another question in the chat, which is any chance a Boundary Helm chart to deploy on Kubernetes? I guess right now we're trying to make sure we get all of the right security in place for Boundary on individual machines, right? Once you add it to Kubernetes, there are other security considerations. So if you're interested in creating one, we appreciate the thought and the potential community contribution. But we're trying to make sure that we cover our bases for the Boundary deployment on virtual machines at this time. All right. Any other questions in chat? Any other comments from either Rob or Jim? We appreciate you coming and showing some awesome stuff today. It's really exciting. And, as it continues to progress, I look forward to seeing more features and functionality and all the interesting ways to configure them.
Thanks for having us.